3 days ago, you were important. Now there is somebody else. And somehow they are posting pictures, laughing, going out, acting normal, while you're sitting there trying to understand how a person can move from emotional intimacy to apparent indifference without even looking back. That contrast is brutal. Because your mind doesn't just register the breakup, it registers the replacement. And replacement creates a very specific kind of wound. It whispers, maybe I didn't matter as much as I thought. But stop there, because the speed of someone's next connection is not a reliable measurement of the depth of the previous one. Sometimes the person who appears to move fastest is not the person who processed everything fastest. They may simply be using a completely different emotional strategy. For an avoidantly attached person, distance can become a form of emotional regulation. Instead of moving toward the painful feeling, they may move away from it. And sometimes away looks like another relationship, another person, another routine, another story. Suddenly, there is something new occupying the space where the old relationship used to be. But here is where things become psychologically interesting. A replacement can be real without being a replacement of your emotional significance. The new person may genuinely matter. The new relationship may even become serious. But that still doesn't tell you what happened internally with the previous relationship. Because people don't always leave relationships after emotionally completing them. Sometimes they leave because staying connected to the feelings has become uncomfortable. That's the thread we're going to follow through all 5 reasons. Not to convince you that your avoidant secretly wants you back. Not to give you false hope. And definitely not to make you compete with whoever came next. We're going deeper than that. We're looking at why some avoidants can create distance, enter something new, and appear completely untouched by what they left behind. Because once you understand the mechanism, the question changes. It stops being, why was I so easy to replace? And becomes, what was happening inside them when they walked away? That distinction changes everything. The relationship doesn't always disappear first. Sometimes the feeling of the relationship gets switched off. That distinction matters. Emotional deactivation is essentially a psychological distancing process. When closeness starts activating discomfort, the person may reduce their emotional investment, suppress attachment needs, focus on flaws, or convince themselves that distance is the better option. From the outside, this can look cold. Inside, it can function like an emergency exit. Imagine the relationship becoming emotionally loud. Your questions become louder. Their feelings become louder. The expectations become louder. The vulnerability becomes louder. And instead of turning the volume down gradually, their nervous system reaches for the fastest available button. Disconnect. Suddenly, memories that once felt warm become irritating. Conversations that once mattered begin feeling exhausting. Your emotional needs start looking like pressure. Their own feelings become inconvenient. And the more uncomfortable the internal experience becomes, the more attractive emotional distance can feel. This is why an avoidant may seem strangely calm after separation. They may have started psychologically leaving before the relationship officially ended. You experienced the ending on one date. They may have been emotionally rehearsing it for weeks or months. That's why your timelines can look completely different. You are standing at the beginning of the breakup. They may feel like they're already several chapters ahead. And then comes the dangerous comparison. You see them with someone new and think, they clearly didn't care. But deactivation can create exactly that appearance. The person isn't necessarily sitting there thinking about how much they hurt you. They may be actively narrowing their emotional focus so they don't have to experience the full weight of the loss. And here's the part people miss. Deactivation isn't the same thing as emotional resolution. Someone can suppress a feeling without understanding it. They can distance themselves without healing it. They can move forward without fully processing what happened. So when you see an avoidant looking unaffected, don't automatically translate that image into "they never cared." Sometimes the visible distance is precisely the coping mechanism. And once that mechanism is in place, the next psychological step becomes much easier. Finding something that keeps the emotional distance intact. There is something deceptively powerful about being with someone who doesn't know your history. No accumulated arguments, no unresolved conversations, no expectations based on past promises. No person watching closely enough to notice when your emotional walls go up. Just novelty. And novelty can feel incredibly light. This is one reason a new relationship can appear almost magically better from the outside. The avoidant isn't necessarily thinking, "This person is better than my ex." The experience may simply feel different. The new relationship hasn't accumulated emotional weight yet. There hasn't been enough time for deeper expectations to form. There may be less pressure to define feelings, less pressure to explain silence, less pressure to become vulnerable. And for someone uncomfortable with emotional intensity, that can feel like relief. Think about the difference between meeting someone for the first time and being deeply known by someone for years. The first experience contains possibility. The second contains exposure. A new person may admire the polished version. The previous partner may have seen the frightened version, the confused version, the withdrawn version, the version that needed space, the version that struggled to communicate. Being deeply known can be far more activating than being newly admired. So the avoidant may look warmer with the new person. They may text more. They may post more. They may appear affectionate. And that can be devastating to watch, because your mind immediately asks, "Why couldn't they do that with me?" But early-stage behavior doesn't always predict long-term emotional capacity. People can be charming when intimacy is still optional. The real test begins when vulnerability becomes unavoidable. When someone asks for emotional accountability. When conflict appears. When expectations increase. When the relationship stops being exciting and starts requiring emotional participation. That is when attachment patterns become much more visible. So don't use the honeymoon phase of somebody else's relationship as evidence against your entire relationship. You are comparing your relationship's most emotionally demanding chapters with their new relationship's opening scene. Those are not equivalent. And there is another layer. Sometimes the new relationship doesn't replace the old relationship emotionally. It replaces the environment in which the old feelings were activated. New person, new routine, new identity, new distraction, new emotional distance. That's why "they found someone new" doesn't automatically answer the deeper question. The deeper question is, what did being with you require from them that being new with someone else doesn't require yet? That question leads directly into reason number 3. There is a strange moment in some avoidant relationships. At first, closeness feels wonderful. Then it becomes real. And once it becomes real, the emotional temperature changes. The calls become expectations. The affection becomes vulnerability. The relationship becomes something that can actually hurt. And suddenly, the same closeness that once felt comforting begins feeling restrictive. This is where people often get confused. They think, if they loved being close to me, Why did they suddenly need distance? Because intimacy is not only about receiving love, it is also about being seen. And being seen creates exposure. Your partner learns what hurts you, what you need, what you notice, what makes you anxious, what makes you feel safe. They learn when you're disappointed. They learn when you're pulling away. Eventually, they can see behind the emotional armor. For someone with strong avoidant tendencies, that level of emotional visibility can create an uncomfortable internal conflict. One part says, "I want this connection." Another says, "I don't want to depend on this connection." And another may quietly say, "If this person matters this much, they can hurt me." That last thought can change everything. Distance suddenly feels safer than dependence. Independence starts feeling like protection. And the relationship becomes something they need to control, rather than simply experience. This is why an avoidant can sometimes retreat precisely when the bond becomes stronger. Not necessarily because attraction disappeared. Sometimes because the emotional stakes increased. And once the relationship feels like a place where they are expected to show up emotionally, avoidance can become tempting. A new person can temporarily remove that pressure. There is no history yet, no accumulated emotional contract, no established expectation that they should communicate differently. They can simply exist, and that can feel incredibly freeing. But here's the uncomfortable truth. A relationship that feels easier isn't necessarily a relationship that is healthier. Sometimes it is simply a relationship that hasn't reached the difficult stage yet. So if your avoidant became involved with someone else shortly after leaving you, don't automatically conclude they became emotionally available for someone else. Maybe. But another possibility is that the new relationship hasn't demanded the kind of vulnerability that the previous relationship eventually demanded. And that difference becomes critical. Because attraction can survive distance. Novelty can survive avoidance. But sustained intimacy requires emotional participation. And that is exactly where many avoidant patterns are tested. After a relationship ends, the brain doesn't always give us a perfectly balanced documentary. It edits. It selects. It highlights certain scenes and pushes others into the background. And when someone is struggling with the emotional consequences of leaving, that editing process can become extremely useful. The relationship starts getting remembered through its problems, the arguments, the misunderstandings, the emotional conversations, the moments when you wanted reassurance, the moments when they felt overwhelmed. Slowly, the story changes. Instead of, "We had something meaningful that became difficult," the internal narrative can become, "That relationship was exhausting." Instead of, "We struggled with intimacy," it becomes, "We were incompatible." Instead of, "I felt emotionally overwhelmed," it becomes, "They were too demanding." This doesn't necessarily mean the person is deliberately manipulating reality. Human beings naturally construct stories that help them live with difficult decisions. But when avoidance is involved, the story can become especially protective. If the relationship is framed as fundamentally wrong, then leaving feels less painful. And if the new relationship feels easy, that new relationship becomes evidence supporting the revised story. See, this is better. This feels natural. This person doesn't create all that pressure. And suddenly, the past relationship has been emotionally downgraded. Not because every good memory disappeared, but because the mind is selectively focusing on whatever makes separation easier to tolerate. This is one reason an avoidant may say things after a breakup that sound surprisingly final. They may speak with certainty. They may sound detached. They may reduce a complicated relationship into a few simple explanations. And you may sit there thinking, how can they summarize years of connection like it meant nothing? Because certainty can sometimes be easier to live with than emotional ambiguity. I don't know how I feel is uncomfortable. I know this wasn't right for me is much easier to hold. And this is where you need to protect yourself. Do not spend months trying to prove that their new story is wrong. You cannot heal by winning an argument inside somebody else's head. Maybe they remember the relationship differently. Maybe they genuinely believe their decision was right. Maybe they will later see things differently. You don't need to predict which one. Your job is to stop letting their current narrative become the definition of your value. Because there is still one final reason, and it may be the most misunderstood of all. Sometimes the person isn't replacing you. They're replacing the emotional experience of having to sit with the loss. This is where the entire picture becomes more complicated. A new person enters. The avoidant seems happy. The old relationship disappears from view, and everyone assumes the story is finished. But emotional processing doesn't always happen in public. Someone can be dating while still carrying unresolved emotions. Someone can laugh while grieving. Someone can look completely composed while avoiding the exact thoughts they don't want to confront. And someone can genuinely care about a new partner while still having unresolved feelings about an old relationship. Human emotions are not a cue. One person doesn't always disappear emotionally the moment another person arrives. But don't turn that idea into false hope. Unresolved feelings do not automatically mean someone will return. Missing you does not mean they are ready for you. Regret does not equal emotional growth. And thinking about the past does not mean the relationship should be restarted. That distinction is essential. Sometimes a new relationship functions as movement. Anything that keeps the person moving can prevent them from having to stop and ask, what did I lose? What happened between us? Why did closeness become so uncomfortable? What part did I play in the ending? Those questions are heavy. A new relationship can keep them occupied long enough to postpone them. And this is why the speed of a rebound or new relationship tells you very little by itself. You cannot diagnose someone's emotional state from their Instagram photos. You cannot calculate their attachment to you by how quickly they started dating. You cannot determine whether they healed because they stopped texting. And you definitely cannot measure your worth against the person who came next. The new person may be wonderful. Your old relationship may still have mattered. Both can be true. And that is far more psychologically realistic than the fantasy that either they replaced me because I meant nothing, or they secretly still love me and will definitely come back. Neither conclusion is guaranteed. The healthiest interpretation sits somewhere in the middle. Their coping pattern belongs to them. Your worth belongs to you. Once you understand that, something changes. You stop monitoring their relationship. You stop decoding every photograph. You stop comparing your personality to theirs. And you stop asking whether the new person is better. Because the real victory isn't getting replaced and somehow becoming unforgettable. The real victory is reaching the point where being replaced no longer determines how you see yourself. Let's remove the mystery for a moment. Your avoidant has someone new. What does that fact actually tell you? It tells you one thing with certainty. They are involved with someone new. That's it. Everything beyond that requires interpretation. It does not automatically tell you that they love the new person more. It does not prove they never loved you. It does not prove they're secretly miserable. It does not prove they will come back. And it certainly doesn't prove that you were replaceable. Yet this is exactly where people get trapped. They begin collecting evidence. She posted this. He liked that. They went on vacation. They look happier. They never looked that happy with me. Every new piece of information becomes another emotional courtroom. And you're both the investigator and the person on trial. That's exhausting. More importantly, it keeps your emotional life connected to somebody else's behavior. Instead, look at what their actions tell you about availability. If they left, they're unavailable. If they chose someone else, they're choosing another relationship. If they aren't communicating, they're not communicating. You don't need to decode hidden emotions to respond to visible behavior. This is where emotional maturity becomes incredibly powerful. You can acknowledge, maybe they cared. Maybe they didn't know how to handle the connection. Maybe they have unresolved feelings. Maybe they genuinely moved on. And then say, regardless, I need a relationship where emotional availability is visible. That sentence changes the entire dynamic. Because you're no longer trying to solve the avoidant. You're evaluating the relationship. There's a major difference. One keeps you obsessed with their psychology. The other brings you back to your own standards. You don't need someone to secretly miss you. You need someone capable of showing up. You don't need someone to regret losing you. You need someone who recognizes your value while they still have access to you. You don't need to beat the new person. You need to stop competing. And once you stop competing, the word replace loses some of its power. Because people are not interchangeable products. A relationship ending doesn't mean your identity was replaced. It means one relationship ended and another began. Their choice may be painful, but it does not get to become your definition. There is a moment after heartbreak when you realize something uncomfortable. You have spent more time studying their behavior than listening to your own pain. You know when they were online. You know when they posted. You know who they follow. You know whether they look happy. You know whether the new relationship appears serious. But somewhere along the way, you stopped asking, "Am I okay?" That's the question that deserves your attention now. Because the most dangerous part of being replaced isn't necessarily losing the relationship. It's allowing the replacement to rewrite your self-image. You start thinking, maybe I'm not attractive enough. Maybe I wasn't exciting enough. Maybe the new person is easier to love. Maybe I asked for too much. Maybe I wasn't enough. And slowly, the breakup becomes an identity statement. It wasn't. It was a relationship outcome. Those are not the same thing. Someone's attachment style, coping strategy, emotional capacity, or relationship decision does not provide a final verdict on your worth. You can be deeply lovable and still experience rejection. You can be emotionally available and still be left. You can offer genuine love to someone who is not capable of receiving it consistently. That doesn't make your love worthless. It makes the match limited. And there is another powerful shift you can make. Stop asking, how do I become impossible for my avoidant to forget? Ask, why do I need to be unforgettable to feel valuable? That question goes deeper. Because healing isn't about becoming the person they regret losing. Healing is becoming the person who no longer needs their regret. Maybe they come back someday. Maybe they don't. Maybe the new relationship lasts. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe they eventually understand what happened. Maybe they never do. Your life cannot remain suspended while you wait for an answer. The relationship already gave you information. It showed you what happened when intimacy met their emotional defenses. Now you get to decide what happens when your self-respect meets your heartbreak. And that is where the story stops being about the avoidant. It becomes about you. You don't need to erase the relationship. You don't need to pretend you never cared. You don't need to convince yourself that your avoidant was a terrible person. And you don't need to convince yourself that they secretly want you back. You need something much quieter. Acceptance. Acceptance sounds like, I loved them. The relationship mattered to me. Their behavior hurt me. I may never fully understand what happened inside them, and I can still move forward. That last sentence is freedom, because closure doesn't always arrive as an explanation from the person who left. Sometimes closure is the decision to stop demanding an explanation before allowing yourself to live. Your avoidant may have moved quickly. They may have found someone else. They may appear completely fine. None of those things erase what you experienced, and none of them determine what comes next for you. So if you're still comparing yourself to the new person, step out of that competition. If you're still checking their social media, create distance. If you're still waiting for a message, stop building your emotional future around a possibility. And if part of you still hopes they return, be honest about it. You don't have to shame yourself for caring. Just don't confuse hope with a plan. The deepest lesson here is simple. Someone can leave your life without taking your value with them. They can choose another relationship without proving you were inferior. They can move forward without proving you were forgotten. And they can even remember you without becoming capable of giving you the relationship you needed. That's why your healing cannot depend on what happens inside their mind next. It has to begin with what happens inside yours. You are not a placeholder. You are not a failed experiment. You are not made less valuable because someone chose a different path. You were a person who loved, a person who hoped, a person who connected. And now, a person who gets to choose differently. Not necessarily a different person, a different standard, a different relationship with yourself, a different definition of love. Because the goal isn't to make an avoidant realize they replaced the wrong person. The goal is to reach a place where you no longer need to be chosen by someone who couldn't consistently choose you. That is the moment being replaced stops feeling like the end of your story. It becomes the moment you finally start writing a better one.